What if I told you that one wrong turn would lead Hollywood legend Clint Eastwood to become the unlikely guardian of an Amish community? In the peaceful farmlands of Pennsylvania, where horse-drawn buggies still rule the roads, a corrupt developer thought he'd found easy prey in a humble Amish farmer. But he never expected to face down Clint Eastwood, a man who'd spent decades playing heroes now becoming one in real life. When black SUVs and armed men surrounded the Fisher family's farm, something extraordinary happened. The man who made Make My Day famous didn't reach for a gun. He reached for something far more powerful. How did a simple land dispute transform into an epic showdown between greed and tradition? And why did America's most famous tough guy choose to stand with the most peaceful people on earth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Life has a peculiar way of steering us down unexpected paths, much like the dusty Pennsylvania back road that brought Clint Eastwood's weathered pickup truck to a gentle stop one autumn morning. The legendary actor-turned-wanderer hadn't planned on visiting Lancaster County, but something about the rolling hills dotted with traditional Amish farms stirred a forgotten longing in his soul. Who could have predicted that a simple wrong turn would lead to one of the most significant chapters in not only his life, but in the lives of 3 generations of the Fisher family? The first signs of trouble materialized when Clint noticed a group of black SUVs parked haphazardly along the fence line of an old Amish farm. Through the morning mist, he could make out the silhouettes of men in expensive suits, their aggressive postures a stark contrast to the peaceful countryside. Among them stood Calvin Briggs, a real estate developer whose reputation preceded him like a dark cloud, gesturing animatedly toward an elderly Amish man who stood his ground with quiet dignity. Eli Fisher had faced many challenges in his 70 years, but none quite like this. His weathered hands gripped his suspenders as he listened to Briggs's latest threats, his face betraying no emotion save for a slight tightening around his eyes. Behind him, his daughter Mary watched from the farmhouse porch, her worried gaze shifting between her father and her teenage son Jacob, who stood tensely at the edge of their cornfield. The scene caught Clint's attention, not for its drama, but for its familiarity. He'd seen this story play out countless times before, both in movies and in real life, the powerful trying to bully the vulnerable. Without conscious thought, he found himself pulling over and stepping out of his truck, his boots crunching on the gravel driveway. Sheriff Tom Hensley noticed the newcomer first, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holster. The local lawman's presence alongside Briggs's team spoke volumes about the corruption that had taken root in this quiet corner of Pennsylvania. His eyes narrowed as he recognized the famous face approaching them, uncertainty flickering across his features. "Seems like an awful lot of people for a friendly morning chat," Clint observed, his voice carrying the same quiet authority that had made him a screen legend. The simple statement caused Briggs to spin around, momentarily thrown off his practiced script. The developer's expensive suit and manicured appearance couldn't mask the predatory gleam in his eyes. Young Jacob Fisher watched the exchange with growing interest, his 17 years of sheltered life having never prepared him for the sight of his childhood hero materializing in their time of need. Despite his traditional upbringing, Jacob had secretly maintained a fascination with the outside world, particularly with the films he'd glimpsed during his rumspring of visits to town. Mary Fisher's grip on her apron tightened as she observed this unexpected intervention. Her husband's death 3 years prior had left her wary of outsiders, especially those from the English world. Yet something about the stranger's calm demeanor and the way he positioned himself, not confrontational but unmistakably present, sparked a glimmer of hope she thought she'd lost. Briggs recovered quickly, plastering on a practiced smile that never reached his eyes. "Mr. Eastwood, this is a private matter between my development company and these simple folk. I'm sure you understand the importance of progress." His words dripped with condescension, but Clint had weathered far worse in his decades in Hollywood. The tension in the air shifted as Eli Fisher stepped forward, his quiet dignity a sharp contrast to Briggs's artificial charm. "We want no trouble," he stated simply, his voice carrying the weight of generations who had worked this land. But this farm is not for sale, today or any day. Sheriff Hensley shifted uncomfortably, caught between his duty to the law and his obligations to Briggs. The morning sun cast long shadows across the farmyard as these unlikely players found themselves drawn into a conflict that would test not only their beliefs but their understanding of justice, community, and the true meaning of progress. What none of them realized in that moment was how this chance encounter would set in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. For Clint, it would become a journey of redemption. For Jacob, a path to understanding his place between two worlds. For Mary, a lesson in trust. And for Eli, a test of faith that would shake the very foundations of his beliefs. The late summer sun cast long shadows across the Fisher farm as Clint Eastwood watched the confrontation unfold from his parked motorcycle. The scene before him could have been lifted straight from one of his old westerns, only instead of cowboys and cattle barons, it was an elderly Amish farmer standing his ground against a man in an expensive suit. Eli Fisher's weathered face remained stoic as Calvin Briggs gestured dramatically at the surrounding farmland, his voice carrying across the distance. "This isn't just about your farm anymore, Fisher. Progress doesn't wait for stubborn old men." The developer's polished appearance contrasted sharply with Eli's simple black clothing and full beard, a visual representation of the worlds colliding on this peaceful afternoon. Behind Eli stood his daughter Mary, her hand protectively on young Jacob's shoulder. The boy's eyes darted between his grandfather and Briggs, his face a mixture of concern and barely contained anger. What thoughts ran through a 17-year-old Amish boy's mind as he watched his family's heritage threatened? Sheriff Tom Hensley lounged against his patrol car, attempting to project casual authority, but failing to mask his discomfort. His badge caught the sunlight as he shifted position, a reminder of law enforcement's presence in this increasingly tense situation. But whose law was he really enforcing? Clint's fingers drummed thoughtfully on his motorcycle's handlebar as he assessed the dynamics playing out before him. Calvin Briggs's body language screamed of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation, while Eli Fisher exhibited the quiet strength of a man whose convictions ran deeper than mere stubbornness. Mary Fisher's attention, suddenly, shifted to Clint's presence, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. Who could blame her? In a community where outsiders often brought trouble, another stranger was the last thing they needed. Yet something in her stance suggested she was weighing options, perhaps recognizing that sometimes help came from unexpected quarters. Jacob's reaction proved more interesting. The young man studied Clint with undisguised curiosity, his gaze lingering on the motorcycle. How many Amish youth struggled with the pull between their traditional world and the modern one that surrounded them? In Jacob's face, Clint recognized the familiar conflict of a young man trying to find his place between two worlds. Calvin Briggs's voice rose again, drawing Clint's attention back to the central conflict. "The county council meeting is next week. This is your last chance to be reasonable, Fisher." The threat in his tone was unmistakable, but Eli remained unmoved. "We have lived on this land for generations," Eli replied, his voice carrying the weight of years and conviction. "Our ways may seem strange to thee, but they are our choice and our right." Sheriff Hensley straightened, finally choosing to intervene. "Now, Eli, nobody's questioning your rights, but times change and sometimes we all need to adapt." His attempted diplomacy rang hollow, tainted by the sideways glance he cast at Briggs. How deep did that influence run? The tension crackled in the air like static before a storm. Clint had seen enough situations like this to know that initial confrontations often set the stage for escalating conflicts. What would push this beyond words to something more dangerous? And more importantly, what role would he choose to play in what was unfolding? Mary Fisher guided Jacob toward the farmhouse, her movements deliberate and protective. But the boy resisted slightly, his attention still divided between the confrontation and Clint's presence. In that moment of hesitation, Clint caught a glimpse of someone standing at a crossroads, not just between tradition and progress, but between acceptance and action. Calvin Briggs finally turned away from Eli, his frustration evident in every Movement. As he stalked back to his luxury car, his gaze locked with Clint's. A flash of recognition crossed his face. Not of Clint personally, but of the type of man who might complicate his plans. Would this become more than just a simple property dispute? The developer's departure left a wake of unresolved tension. Sheriff Hensley lingered, shifting his weight uncomfortably before following Briggs's example and retreating to his patrol car. The law enforcement officer's reluctance to meet anyone's eyes spoke volumes about the compromises already made. Eli Fisher remained standing in his field, a solitary figure representing generations of tradition against the tide of change. But as Clint observed the subtle straightening of the old man's shoulders, he wondered if perhaps tradition had more strength than its opponents suspected. What would it take to preserve this way of life against those who saw only profit in the land? Jacob Fisher stood transfixed at the edge of his grandfather's cornfield, his eyes locked on the weathered face of the stranger who had witnessed the confrontation between Eli Fisher and Calvin Briggs. There was something hauntingly familiar about the man's stance, the way he carried himself with quiet authority, and the calculating gaze that seemed to absorb every detail of the unfolding drama. Recognition dawned slowly, like the first rays of morning sun breaking through the Lancaster County mist. Jacob had secretly watched Western movies at his friend's house, against the wishes of his Amish community. The stranger's presence stirred memories of those forbidden afternoons spent marveling at tales of justice and redemption on the small screen. Clint noticed the young man's scrutiny, recognizing the mix of awe and uncertainty in Jacob's eyes. How many times had he seen that same look during his decades in Hollywood? But this was different. There was something genuine about the boy's demeanor that cut through the usual celebrity worship. Here, in the heart of Amish country, his fame felt oddly irrelevant. The tension from the earlier confrontation still hung in the air like summer humidity. Calvin Briggs's threats against Eli Fisher echoed in Clint's mind, stirring memories of countless scripts where powerful men tried to bully honest farmers off their land. But this wasn't a movie set, and these weren't actors reading lines. The stakes were real for the Fisher family. Jacob took a tentative step forward, his traditional Amish attire a stark contrast to his youthful energy. "I know who you are," he said softly, glancing over his shoulder to ensure no one else could hear. "I've seen your films, the ones where you stand up for what's right." Clint's expression remained neutral, but something in the boy's earnest admission touched a chord. How did one explain to a 17-year-old Amish boy that movie heroics were a far cry from real-world complications? Yet there was something in Jacob's eyes that reminded Clint of himself at that age, the desire to make a difference, to stand against injustice. Mary Fisher emerged from the farmhouse, her quick steps betraying her concern as she noticed her son talking to the stranger. Her protective instincts were evident in the way she positioned herself slightly between Jacob and Clint, even as curiosity flickered across her face. What was this outsider's interest in their troubles? The situation presented Clint with a familiar dilemma. Throughout his career, he'd portrayed characters who were drawn into others' fights, usually against their better judgment. Now life seemed to be imitating art, but the consequences would extend beyond a director's cut. Getting involved meant potentially facing not just Calvin Briggs and his puppet Sheriff Hensley, but also challenging the delicate balance of Amish life. Sheriff Hensley's patrol car rolled slowly past the Fisher property, a not-so-subtle reminder of the authority Calvin Briggs wielded in the county. The lawman's gaze lingered on Clint, recognition and wariness mixing in his expression. Word traveled fast in small communities, and Clint's presence had already stirred the local waters. Jacob watched the sheriff's car disappear around the bend, his young face hardening with an understanding beyond his years. "They think because we're Amish we won't fight back," he said, his voice carrying a hint of rebellion that probably worried his mother. But sometimes standing up for what's right means more than following all the rules. Mary's sharp intake of breath at her son's words revealed the complex dynamics at play. How did one maintain traditional values while facing modern threats? The Fisher family's dilemma represented a broader struggle between preservation and adaptation, between holding onto the past and surviving in the present. Clint found himself at a crossroads. His initial plan to quietly pass through Pennsylvania's Amish country now seemed naive in light of the brewing conflict. The familiar pull of justice tugged at him, but experience had taught him that good intentions often pave the way to complicated consequences. Would his intervention help the Fisher family, or would it only escalate tensions with Calvin Briggs and his influential allies? The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Fisher farm as Clint weighed his options. In his films, this would be the moment where the hero commits to the cause, setting the story on its inevitable path toward confrontation and resolution. But real life rarely followed such neat narratives. What role would he choose to play in this unfolding drama? The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Fisher farm as Clint stood at the edge of their property, his weathered hands resting on the wooden fence. The decision to stay hadn't come easily. Decades of drifting had taught him the dangers of putting down roots even temporarily. But something about young Jacob's earnest plea and the quiet dignity of the Fisher family stirred memories he'd long tried to forget. Mary Fisher watched from her kitchen window, her brow furrowed with concern as she observed the stranger who'd suddenly inserted himself into their lives. The community had weathered storms before, but Calvin Briggs's increasing pressure on her father's land threatened to destroy everything they'd built. Could they trust this outsider, this man, whose very presence seemed to challenge their way of life? Eli Fisher approached Clint with measured steps, his beard catching the golden light. "English," he addressed Clint using the term his people reserved for outsiders. "My grandson speaks highly of thee, but our ways are not your ways." The old man's eyes, sharp despite his years, studied Clint's face for any sign of deception or ulterior motive. Clint's response was characteristically measured. "Mr. Fisher, I've seen men like Briggs before. They mistake kindness for weakness, faith for foolishness. Your grandson showed me something I haven't seen in a long time: genuine courage." The conversation between the two men drew Jacob's attention. From his chores, he moved closer, trying to appear absorbed in his work while straining to hear their exchange. The boy's presence didn't go unnoticed by Clint, who recognized in Jacob the same restless spirit he'd once possessed. Word of Clint's presence spread through the community like ripples in a still pond. Some elders viewed him with suspicion, seeing his intervention as a threat to their traditional ways of handling conflicts through peaceful means. Others, particularly those who had suffered under Briggs's increasingly aggressive tactics, harbored secret hope that this stranger might offer a solution their principles wouldn't allow them to pursue themselves. Sheriff Hensley made his obligatory appearance, parking his cruiser at the edge of the Fisher property. His practiced smile didn't reach his eyes as he approached Clint. "Passing through, I assume?" The question carried an unmistakable edge of warning. Clint met the sheriff's gaze steadily. "Thought I might stay a while. These people seem to need a friend." The implications hung heavy in the air between them, and both men understood this was more than casual conversation. As news reached Calvin Briggs about the stranger taking an interest in the Fisher situation, his carefully laid plans began to show their first signs of unraveling. His reaction was swift, making calls to his connections in the county seat, trying to uncover anything he could about the mysterious man who dared to challenge his authority. Mary found herself torn between tradition and necessity. After evening prayers, she approached Clint, who had taken to sleeping in his truck parked just outside their property. "Why did you really stay?" she asked, her voice carrying both suspicion and hope. The question gave Clint pause. Why indeed? Perhaps it was the echo of his own past in Jacob's eyes, or the quiet strength he recognized in Eli's stance against overwhelming odds. Or maybe after years of wandering, he'd finally found a cause worth fighting for that didn't involve violence. At least not yet. The community's daily rhythm continued unchanged on the surface, but undercurrents of tension grew stronger. Jacob began finding excuses to seek Clint's company, drawn to the stranger's quiet strength and worldly knowledge. Their conversations, though brief, planted seeds of understanding between two vastly different worlds. Eli observed these developments with mixed emotions. The old man's wisdom told him that change was coming to his community, whether they welcomed it or not. The question that kept him awake at night was whether Clint's presence would help them weather that change or hasten their destruction. As the first week of Clint's stay drew to a close, the battle lines were clearly drawn. Calvin Briggs's threats became more overt, the sheriff's patrols more frequent, and the community's resolve was tested daily. Yet something else was growing too, a subtle shift in the air, a sense that perhaps the Fishers' quiet faith and Clint's steel-eyed determination might forge an alliance powerful enough to stand against the gathering storm. What none of them realized was that the true test of their unlikely partnership was just beginning. Could Clint's worldly experience complement the Fishers' unwavering faith? Or would his presence only serve to hasten the very destruction he hoped to prevent? The autumn wind carried whispers through Lancaster County as Mary Fisher watched the stranger, Clint Eastwood, split wood behind their barn. His presence over the past week had stirred conflicting emotions within her tight-knit Amish community, and more importantly, within her own heart. How could she trust this Englishman who seemed to materialize from nowhere, especially when her son Jacob looked at him with such admiration? Mary's hands worked methodically at the butter churn, her movements betraying the tension she felt. Through the kitchen window, she observed Jacob approaching Clint, their easy conversation evident in their body language. The sight brought back memories of her late husband, teaching Jacob the ways of their people, memories that now felt threatened by this outsider's influence. Calvin Briggs's latest visit had left her father, Eli, more troubled than usual. The deep, developers' thinly veiled threats about tax assessments and property regulations had begun to wear on the elderly man's resolve. Mary noticed how Eli's shoulders seemed to carry an extra burden these days, though he tried to hide it from her and Jacob. What worried her more was how Clint had somehow inserted himself into their private struggles, offering advice and support that her father increasingly seemed to value. The community elders had called a meeting to discuss the mounting pressure from Calvin and his allies. Mary knew they would also address the matter of Clint's growing involvement in their affairs. Bishop Stoltzfus had expressed concern about the Englishman's influence, particularly on the younger members of their community. Yet Mary couldn't deny that since Clint's arrival, Calvin's men had become more hesitant in their intimidation tactics. Jacob's laughter drifted through the window, a sound Mary hadn't heard much since Calvin began his campaign against their land. Her son had grown serious beyond his years, shouldering responsibilities that no 17-year-old should have to bear. But watching him with Clint, Mary saw glimpses of the boy he used to be. Was this connection worth the risk of trusting an outsider? The afternoon brought Sarah Yoder, Mary's closest friend, visiting with fresh bread and concerned words. "The Englishman," Sarah whispered, settling at the kitchen table. "He was seen at the sheriff's office yesterday. Some say he and Sheriff Hensley had words." Mary's hand stilled on her work. Sheriff Hensley had been Calvin's most effective tool in pressuring the community, using selective enforcement of regulations to make their lives increasingly difficult. Later, that evening, as Mary prepared dinner, she overheard Clint and her father in serious discussion. Their voices carried through the screen door, words about property laws and constitutional rights mixing with the cricket's evening song. The stranger spoke with knowledge that surprised her, revealing an understanding of their situation that went beyond mere sympathy. Calvin's black sedan appeared the next morning, kicking up dust along their driveway. Mary watched from behind the curtains as Clint stepped out onto the porch, positioning himself between Calvin and their front door. The developer's usual swagger faltered slightly at the sight of the weathered stranger. What power did this man hold that could make someone like Calvin Briggs hesitate? The confrontation was brief but intense, their words too low to hear clearly. Yet Mary saw something she hadn't witnessed before, uncertainty in Calvin's eyes as he retreated to his car. The question that had been nagging at her since Clint's arrival grew stronger. Was this man truly sent to help them, or would his presence bring even greater challenges to their peaceful way of life? That evening, as Mary worked on mending Jacob's shirt, she studied Clint through new eyes. He sat with her father examining old property documents by lamplight, his face etched with genuine concern. Jacob had joined them, absorbing every word, every gesture. The scene stirred something in Mary's heart, a reluctant recognition that perhaps this stranger understood more about protecting family than she had initially believed. But trust came slowly in their world, built on generations of tradition and careful separation from the English way of life. As Mary watched the three men working together, she wondered if sometimes help came in unexpected forms, testing not just their faith, but their ability to recognize God's hand in the most unlikely of messengers. Could Clint Eastwood be such, a messenger, or would trusting him lead them down a path from which there was no return? The autumn sun cast long shadows across the county road as Sheriff Tom Hensley's patrol car pulled alongside Clint Eastwood's weathered pickup truck. The encounter wasn't unexpected. Tensions had been building in the small community ever since Clint had aligned himself with the Fisher family. But what would this confrontation reveal about the town's dark undercurrents? "You're making waves. In places you shouldn't, Eastwood," Hensley said, his badge catching the late afternoon light. His words carried the weight of both warning and threat, though his tone remained professionally detached. "Calvin Briggs has deep roots here, deeper than you might realize." Clint maintained his characteristic stoic demeanor, years of experience, having taught him to read between the lines of such conversations. "Seems to me those roots might be strangling the life out of some honest folks, Sheriff." The exchange sparked a complex dance of power and principle, with Hensley revealing more than he perhaps intended about his connection to Calvin Briggs. The sheriff's hands fidgeted with his belt, a telltale sign of internal conflict that didn't escape Clint's notice. What drove a man sworn to uphold the law to become an instrument of corruption? "The Fishers have been nothing but trouble since they refused to sell," Hensley continued, his voice carrying a hint of resignation. "Mary's got a young boy to think about. Jacob deserves a chance at a better life than what that old farm can offer." The mention of Jacob struck a chord with Clint. The young man's potential had become increasingly apparent during their time together, his quick mind and strong work ethic showing through despite his traditional upbringing. But who had the right to determine what constituted a better life? Hensley's revelation of the broader scheme at play painted a disturbing picture. Calvin's influence extended beyond mere land acquisition. He had systematically worked to control key positions of power throughout the county. The sheriff's department, the county assessor's office, even the local bank, all had fallen under Calvin's sway through a combination of favors, threats, and carefully cultivated relationships. "You've got a choice to make, Eastwood," Hensley said, his expression hardening. "Walk away now or things might get complicated. Calvin's not the kind of man who takes kindly to interference." The warning carried echoes of similar conversations. From Clint's past, moments when standing ground meant choosing between personal safety and moral conviction. How many others had faced this same choice and opted for self-preservation over principle? The sheriff's words also revealed an unexpected vulnerability. His involvement with Calvin wasn't born of pure corruption, but rather a gradual erosion of principles through small compromises and mounting pressures. The man before Clint was both enforcer and prisoner of the very system he helped maintain. "I've known Calvin since we were kids," Hensley admitted, his guard momentarily lowering. "Watched him build his empire one piece at a time. Never thought it'd come to this, but here we are." The confession carried the weight of years of accumulated regret, suggesting that perhaps the sheriff wasn't entirely lost to Calvin's influence. The conversation took an unexpected turn as Hensley shared details about previous families who had stood against Calvin's expansion plans. Their stories painted a pattern of systematic pressure, mysterious accidents, regulatory complications, sudden financial difficulties. Would the Fishers face similar challenges if they continued their resistance? Clint's presence had already begun to disrupt Calvin's carefully constructed network of influence. The sheriff's warning served not only as a threat, but as confirmation that the outsider's support of the Fisher family had struck a nerve. What would it take to unravel the web of control that Calvin had woven throughout the community? As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, the conversation drew to a close, leaving both men with decisions to make. Hensley's return to his patrol car carried the heavy step of a man caught between duty and obligation, while Clint remained rooted in place, processing the implications of what he'd learned. The sheriff's warning had illuminated the true scope of the challenge facing the Fisher family. This wasn't simply about protecting a single farm. It was about confronting a system of corruption that had slowly poisoned the entire community. How could one man, even with the support of a principled family, hope to stand against such deeply entrenched power? The encounter left Clint with crucial information but also raised new questions. How much of Hensley's warning was meant to discourage, and how much was a subtle cry for help from a man looking for redemption? The answers would likely determine not just the fate of the Fisher farm but the future of the entire community. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Fisher farm as Clint watched Jacob struggle with a stubborn fence post. The young man's frustration was evident in his tense shoulders and sharp movements, a reflection of the deeper conflict brewing within him. Having spent decades reading people, Clint recognized the telltale signs of someone torn between two worlds. "You're fighting it too hard," Clint said, his gravelly voice carrying across the field. Jacob looked up, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Sometimes the harder you push, the more resistance you get. That's true of fence posts in life." Jacob's hands dropped from the post as Clint approached, his weathered boots crunching against the frost-covered grass. The boy's eyes held a mixture of respect and curiosity, something Clint had noticed growing stronger since their first encounter. "How would you do it?" Rather than answer directly, Clint positioned himself beside the post, studying its angle and the surrounding soil. "Your grandfather ever tell you about the willow tree? How it bends in the storm while the mighty oak sometimes breaks?" The question hung in the air as understanding slowly dawned on Jacob's face. While they worked together, Clint carefully steered their conversation toward Calvin Briggs, weaving questions between practical lessons about leverage and patience. Jacob's responses revealed patterns of intimidation that had been building for months. Subtle threats at the market, mysterious accidents on neighboring farms, and whispered conversations that stopped when Amish families approached. Mary watched. From the farmhouse porch, her initial wariness of Clint's presence gradually softening as she observed his interactions with her son. The sight stirred memories of Jacob's father, who had possessed the same gentle way of teaching through example rather than lecture. Meanwhile, Eli Fisher moved through his daily routines with practiced efficiency, though his eyes frequently drifted to where Clint and Jacob worked. The old man's face remained impassive, but his shoulders carried less tension than they had in weeks. Perhaps he recognized something in Clint that transcended the boundaries between their different worlds. As the morning progressed, Clint shared stories from his years of handling difficult situations, each tale carefully chosen to illuminate principles of strategy and observation. He taught Jacob how to read people's intentions through their body language, how to spot patterns in seemingly random events, and most importantly, how to maintain calm in the face of pressure. The lessons weren't lost on Jacob, who began connecting these insights to the situation with Calvin Briggs. Last week, when Mr. Briggs came to talk about buying the East Field, he kept looking at his watch and shifting his feet, like he was nervous about something else. Clint nodded, recognizing the boy's growing awareness. The information about Calvin's interest in the East Field added another piece to the puzzle he'd been assembling since Sheriff Hensley's warning. What made that particular plot of land so important to a man who already owned half the county? Their work was interrupted by the distant sound of vehicles approaching. 3 black SUVs appeared on the horizon, kicking up dust as they moved along the county road that bordered the Fisher property. Jacob's body tensed, but he remembered Clint's earlier lessons about staying calm and focused. The vehicles slowed as they passed, tinted windows concealing their occupants. Clint casually positioned himself between Jacob and the road, his experienced eyes noting details about the vehicles. Their new condition, the out-of-state plates, the way they moved in formation rather than casual procession. "Those aren't local," Jacob observed, his voice steady despite the implicit threat in the vehicle's deliberate passage. Clint felt a surge of pride at the young man's growing ability to analyze situations rather than react emotionally to them. The incident provided an opportunity to discuss the importance of documenting patterns and preserving evidence. As they resumed their work, Clint explained how small details could reveal larger truths and how patience often unveiled more than confrontation. These weren't just lessons in self-defense or observation. They were tools for surviving in a world where direct conflict wasn't always the answer. By midday, the fence post stood straight and true, a physical testament to the morning's deeper lessons. But more importantly, Clint had gained valuable insights into Calvin's operations while helping Jacob develop skills that would serve him well beyond the current crisis. The boy was learning to bridge his Amish upbringing with the practical necessities of dealing with the outside world's threats. What neither of them realized was that their morning of mentorship had been observed by more than just Mary and Eli. In a parked car just beyond the farm's boundaries, a figure watched through binoculars, taking particular note of the growing bond between the aging gunslinger and the Amish youth. The observer reached for a phone, knowing this development would interest Calvin Briggs immensely. As twilight settled over the Fisher farm, Eli Fisher and Clint Eastwood sat on the weathered porch, their conversation carrying the weight of generations. The elderly Amish farmer's weathered hands traced invisible patterns on his Bible as he spoke of his ancestors who had first settled this land nearly 2 centuries ago. "My great-grandfather chose this valley because he said it reminded him of God's promise," Eli explained, his voice carrying the cadence of someone well-versed in oral tradition. "He believed the rich soil and clear streams were a sign that our people could prosper here, away from the world's complications." Clint listened intently, recognizing how the Fisher family's deep-rooted connection to their land mirrored conflicts he'd witnessed throughout his life. How many times had he seen powerful men like Calvin Briggs attempt to sever such sacred bonds? The story of the Fishers was far from unique, yet it carried its own distinct melody of perseverance. Jacob's father, my son-in-law, understood our ways despite not being born to them, Eli continued, his eyes distant with memory. He chose this life, chose Mary, chose our community. His death 3 years ago tested our family's faith more than any drought or harsh winter. The mention of Jacob stirred something in Clint's mind. He'd noticed the young man's growing restlessness, the way he stood at the fence line watching cars pass on the distant highway. Was Jacob's internal struggle a reflection of the wider conflict between tradition and progress, or something more personal? Mary appeared in the doorway, carrying a pitcher of fresh lemonade. Her presence shifted the conversation's tone, though her own relationship with tradition seemed complex. She'd remained faithful to her father's ways after her husband's death, but Clint had noticed moments when modern conveniences tempted her resolve. "The English world has always pressed against our borders," Eli acknowledged, using the Amish term, for outsiders. But Calvin Briggs represents something different. His hunger isn't just for land. It's for power over others' lives. Clint understood the unspoken question in Eli's statement. How could a community dedicated to nonviolence defend itself against such aggressive force? The answer lay somewhere between Eli's unwavering faith and Clint's more worldly experience, but finding it would require careful navigation of both perspectives. "Your grandson has a strong spirit," Clint observed, watching Jacob work with the horses in the distant field. "He reminds me of myself at that age, searching for answers beyond what was readily offered." Eli's response carried both pride and concern. "Jacob stands at the crossroads many of our young people face. The path of our ancestors grows narrower with each generation, while the world beyond our gates grows ever more enticing." The conversation turned to Sheriff Hensley, whose gradual submission to Calvin's influence mirrored the broader corruption threatening the valley. Eli spoke of earlier times when the law enforcement officer had been a friend to the Amish community, protecting their interests against those who would take advantage of their peaceful nature. "Sometimes," Eli mused, "the greatest test of faith is maintaining belief in others' capacity for redemption." His words carried special weight given the mounting pressure from Calvin's latest schemes. Mary rejoined them, having finished her evening chores. Her quiet strength reminded Clint of the women he'd known throughout his life, who held communities together through times of crisis. She'd been skeptical of his presence initially, but their shared concern for Jacob had forged an unexpected alliance. "Our ways may seem strange to you," she said, her voice carrying the same measured tone as her father's. "But they've preserved our family through many trials." Clint considered how the Fisher family's struggle represented a larger truth about America itself. The constant tension between preservation and progress, between holding on to what's precious and adapting to survive. Could there be a middle path that honored both the wisdom of the past and the necessities of the present? As night descended over the farm, the conversation between Clint and the Fishers had done more than share history. It had revealed the deep complexities of their current situation. Calvin Briggs wasn't just threatening land and livelihoods, he was challenging a way of life that had sustained generations through faith, community, and dedication to higher principles. What role would Clint play in this unfolding drama? Could his intervention help preserve the Fisher family's heritage while preparing them for the challenges ahead? The answers remained unclear, but the evening's conversation had strengthened his resolve to find them. The morning dew still clung to the grass when Calvin Briggs's black SUV rolled down the dirt road leading to the Fisher farm. His arrival marked a shift in the peaceful rhythm that had settled over the community in recent weeks. Through the windshield, Calvin observed Eli Fisher working in the fields, his traditional Amish attire a stark contrast to the modern world. Calvin represented. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Calvin's recent failures to persuade the Fishers to sell their land had eaten away at his patience. The unexpected presence of Clint Eastwood had complicated matters further, adding an unwelcome variable to what should have been a straightforward acquisition. How had a stranger managed to disrupt his carefully laid plans? At the sheriff's office, Tom Hensley sat behind his desk, wrestling with his conscience. The manila envelope Calvin had left contained enough evidence of past indiscretions to end his career. Yet the growing unease about his role in Calvin's schemes weighed heavily on him. The sound of his phone ringing startled him from his thoughts. Calvin's name flashed on the screen. Meanwhile, Jacob Fisher worked alongside Clint, repairing a section of fencing that had mysteriously collapsed overnight. The teenager's skills with tools had improved under Clint's guidance, but something about the damage bothered the older man. The clean cuts through the support posts suggested deliberate sabotage rather than natural wear. Mary Fisher noticed changes in her son since Clint's arrival. Jacob's confidence had grown, and his questions about the outside world had become more focused, more purposeful. While this transformation worried her, she couldn't deny the positive influence Clint had on Jacob. But would this newfound mentorship survive the mounting pressure from Calvin Briggs? The situation escalated when several of the Fishers' horses were found outside their paddock, having escaped through a section of damaged fencing far from where Clint and Jacob worked. The animals had trampled through newly planted fields, destroying weeks of hard work. Eli stood among the ruined crops, his weathered face masking the turmoil within. Calvin's intimidation tactics grew bolder. Anonymous notes appeared at the Fishers' door, each one carrying veiled threats about the consequences of refusing to sell. The community's silence spoke volumes. Fear of Calvin's influence kept potential allies at bay. Who would stand with the Fishers when doing so meant risking their own security? Sheriff Hensley observed these developments from an uncomfortable middle ground. His badge represented law and order, yet his actions served Calvin's interests. The discord between his duty and his actions created a growing rift in his professional facade. Would he continue to follow Calvin's directives, or would his conscience finally override his fear? Clint recognized the pattern of escalation from his own past experiences. The systematic pressure, the calculated damage, the isolation of the target, all hallmarks of someone used to getting their way through intimidation. But Calvin had underestimated the resilience of the Fisher family and their unexpected ally. The tension reached a new level when Jacob discovered their water supply had been tampered with. The contamination seemed targeted, affecting only the Fishers' well while leaving neighboring farms untouched. This attack on a basic necessity crossed a line that even Sheriff Hensley couldn't ignore. How long could he continue to look the other way? Mary's concern for her family's safety battled with her determination to protect their heritage. Each new incident tested her resolve, yet she found strength in unexpected places. The quiet support from Clint, his steady presence during their troubles gradually transformed her initial skepticism into cautious trust. As Calvin's pressure mounted, the relationship between the Fishers and Clint deepened. They were no longer simply neighbors helping each other, but allies united against a common threat. The question remained, how would they withstand Calvin's escalating tactics while staying true to their principles? The community watched this conflict unfold with bated breath. Calvin's influence had always seemed absolute, but Clint's presence had introduced an element of uncertainty. Would this outsider's intervention be enough to shift the balance of power that had long dominated their small town? The autumn morning carried a distinct chill as Clint Eastwood stood at the edge of Eli Fisher's property, watching the community gather in unprecedented numbers. Who would have thought that a simple land dispute could unite such a traditionally reserved people? The sight of dozens of plain-clothed figures moving purposefully across the fields stirred something deep within him, a reminder of battles fought, long ago but this time without weapons. Jacob Fisher approached, his young face bearing a maturity beyond his 17 years. "Mr. Eastwood, more families are arriving from the northern settlements." His voice carried both excitement and uncertainty, reflecting the community's mixed emotions about taking such bold action. The young man had grown considerably since their first encounter, no longer the hesitant boy caught between two worlds. Eli Fisher emerged from his house, followed by Mary, whose worried expression spoke volumes about the risks they were taking. The elderly farmer had become the unlikely symbol of resistance against Calvin Briggs's aggressive expansion plans. "The English world thinks we are weak because we choose peace," Eli stated, his weathered hands clasped before him. "But there is strength in our unity." Calvin Briggs's recent escalation had crossed an invisible line within the community. The destroyed barn, the poisoned well, and the midnight threats had accomplished what decades of external pressure had failed to do. They had awakened a sleeping giant. The Amish, traditionally isolated in their individual districts, were now communicating and coordinating their responses across county lines. Sheriff Tom Hensley observed the gathering from his patrol car parked along the distant road, his loyalty to Calvin Briggs visibly wavering as he witnessed the peaceful but determined assembly. How long could he continue enforcing unjust actions against people who had never shown anything but respect for the law? Clint had spent the previous weeks helping the community develop strategies that aligned with their principles, while effectively countering Calvin's tactics. The Amish would not fight, but they would stand firm. They organized silent vigils outside the county offices, arranged for English supporters to document and publicize Calvin's violations, and coordinated their market days to demonstrate their economic importance to the region. Mary Fisher, initially skeptical of Clint's involvement, now worked closely with him to coordinate communication between the districts. "We have always believed that our strength lies in separation from the English world," she confided one evening. "Perhaps we were wrong. Perhaps sometimes we must engage to preserve our way of life." The community's response transformed the conflict. Calvin's usual tactics of intimidation lost their power when faced with hundreds of silent, peaceful observers. His workers refused to operate machinery when surrounded by Amish families, quietly working their fields or conducting their daily business. How could anyone justify violence against people who responded to threats with offers of food and prayer? Jacob found himself at the heart of this transformation, bridging the gap between the English world strategies and Amish traditions. His understanding of both worlds proved invaluable, as he helped translate Clint's tactical suggestions into actions that the elders could accept. The mentor relationship between Clint and Jacob deepened through these challenges, each learning from the other's perspective. Sheriff Hensley's internal struggle became increasingly visible. During one particularly tense confrontation, when Calvin demanded arrests for trespassing, the sheriff finally spoke up. "These people have legal rights to their land, Calvin. Maybe it's time we looked at whose actions are really breaking the law." The shift in his allegiance marked a crucial turning point in the community's fight. The resistance strategies began showing results. Local media attention increased, drawn by the unusual sight of Amish unity and peaceful protest. Calvin's business partners started asking uncomfortable questions about his methods. The county commissioners, faced with unprecedented attendance at their meetings, could no longer ignore the issue. Clint watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and humility. These people had always possessed the strength to stand against injustice, They had simply needed someone to help them recognize how to use that strength without compromising their principles. The sight of young Jacob organizing his peers, of Mary finding her voice in community meetings, and of Eli standing tall despite the pressure, confirmed that sometimes the greatest victories come not through force, but through unwavering conviction. As the community gathered for their evening prayer meeting, the question hanging in the air was not if they would succeed, but how their success would change them. Would this unprecedented unity alter their traditional way of life, or would it reinforce their values while teaching them new ways to preserve their culture in a changing world? The autumn morning brought an unwelcome chill as Sheriff Tom Hensley's patrol car kicked up dust along the narrow road leading to the Fisher farm. Behind the wheel, his knuckles whitened against the steering wheel, knowing the task ahead wasn't just another routine arrest. Calvin Briggs had made his expectations clear: bring in Eli Fisher, by any means necessary. Clint Eastwood observed the approaching vehicle from the Fisher's barn, where he and Jacob had been repairing farm equipment. The familiar knot of tension returned to his stomach, the same feeling he'd carried through countless confrontations in his past. But this time, the stakes felt personal. How would the peaceful Amish community respond to such a direct assault on one of their elders? Inside the Fisher home, Mary was preparing the morning meal when she heard the car door slam. Through the window, she watched Sheriff Hensley adjust his gun belt, an unnecessary gesture that spoke volumes about his intentions. What right did they have to disturb their peaceful existence? Her father, Eli, sat calmly at the kitchen table, as if already knowing what was to come. "Sheriff Hensley," Clint called out, emerging from the barn with Jacob close behind. "Bit early for social calls, isn't it?" The sheriff's hand instinctively moved toward his holster. "This doesn't concern you, stranger. I've got a warrant for Eli Fisher's arrest." The accusation hung heavy in the air: tax evasion and fraudulent business practices. Anyone who knew Eli understood the absurdity of these charges. The Amish elder had lived his entire life by a strict moral code that made such crimes unthinkable. But Calvin Briggs had constructed his case carefully, manipulating records and fabricating evidence with the precision of a man accustomed to bending the law to his will. Mary stepped onto the porch, her face a mask of controlled anger. "These charges are false, and you know it, Tom. How much is Calvin paying you to destroy an innocent man's reputation?" The sheriff's face reddened, but before he could respond, Eli emerged from the house. His quiet dignity stood in stark contrast to the sheriff's nervous energy. "I will go peacefully," Eli stated, his voice steady. "Our ways teach us to submit to authority, even when that authority is misused." Jacob moved forward, his young face twisted with confusion and anger. "But grandfather, we can't let them." Clint placed a restraining hand on Jacob's shoulder, understanding the delicate balance between resistance and respect for the Amish ways. How could they fight back without compromising the very principles that defined this community? As Sheriff Hensley led Eli to the patrol car, the news spread through the community with remarkable speed. Within hours, Amish families began arriving at the Fisher farm, bringing food, offers of help, and most importantly, their unified support. Calvin Briggs had underestimated the strength of these bonds. "What happens now?" Jacob asked Clint, watching as more buggies arrived carrying concerned neighbors. The question carried weight beyond the immediate crisis. Could peaceful resistance stand against calculated corruption? Would the community's faith withstand this test of justice? Clint studied the gathering crowd, recognizing the power in their quiet determination. Mary joined them, her initial skepticism of Clint forgotten in the face of their common enemy. "Calvin thinks he can break us by taking our leader," she observed. "He doesn't understand that our strength comes from something deeper than any one person." The community's response took shape organically. While maintaining their peaceful principles, they organized a silent vigil outside the county jail. The sight of dozens of Amish families standing in quiet protest drew media attention, exactly what Calvin Briggs had hoped to avoid. Clint worked behind the scenes, leveraging his own connections to investigate the charges. Each piece of evidence he uncovered revealed more of Calvin's desperate scheme to force the Amish off their land. But would exposing the truth be enough to secure Eli's freedom? The arrest had achieved one thing Calvin hadn't intended. It united the community more strongly than ever. Even those who had considered selling their land now stood firm, recognizing that their way of life faced a critical threat. The question remained, how would this peaceful community defend itself against an enemy who played by no rules? As the sun set on that first difficult day, Clint watched Jacob struggle with his conflicting emotions. The young man's desire to take direct action warred with his respect for his grandfather's peaceful approach. Could there be a middle ground that honored both the need for justice and the Amish commitment to nonviolence? The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Lancaster County as Jacob Fisher slipped away from his family's farm, his heart pounding with equal measures of determination and fear. The recent arrest of his grandfather Eli had shaken the entire Amish community, but none more than Jacob, who had witnessed firsthand the corruption that had led to this moment. Clint Eastwood had warned him against this very action, but Jacob couldn't stand idle while his family's future hung in the balance. The young man's traditional black pants and blue shirt helped him blend into the shadows as he made his way toward town, his mind racing with the instructions Clint had given him during their clandestine meetings over the past weeks. In town, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Local residents whispered behind their hands as Jacob passed, their eyes following his progress down the main street. The arrest of an Amish elder had created a ripple effect throughout the community, forcing people to choose sides in a conflict they'd rather ignore. Some nodded respectfully to Jacob while others turned away, afraid to be seen acknowledging him. The sheriff's office loomed ahead, its windows gleaming in the dying light. Jacob knew Sheriff Hensley would be inside, possibly with Calvin Briggs, plotting their next move against his family. The thought of Calvin made Jacob's blood boil, the man who had systematically worked to destroy everything the Fisher family had built over generations. Mary Fisher would be beside herself if she knew what her son was doing. She had already lost her husband, and now with Eli in jail, her protective instincts had reached new heights. But Jacob had learned something from Clint. Sometimes protection meant taking action, even when that action carried significant risk. The relationship between Clint and Jacob had grown stronger through adversity. The older man had recognized something in Jacob, a spark of determination that mirrored his own youth. Their conversations, though brief and careful to avoid community attention, had given Jacob tools he never knew he needed: observation skills, strategic thinking, and most importantly, the courage to stand up against injustice. As Jacob approached the back of the sheriff's office, he recalled Clint's words about gathering information. Listen more than you speak. Watch their patterns. Every corrupt man has a routine they can't break. The wisdom of these words guided Jacob as he positioned himself near an open window, hidden by the growing darkness and a convenient stack of crates. Inside, voices carried through the evening air. Sheriff Hensley's distinctive drawl mixed with Calvin Briggs's sharper tones. Their conversation focused on property deeds and upcoming court dates. Jacob strained to catch every word, knowing that each piece of information could be crucial to proving his grandfather's innocence. The risk Jacob took wasn't just physical. Discovery could mean severe consequences from both law enforcement and his own community. The Amish way emphasized peace, forgiveness, and non-confrontation. Yet here he was, engaging in what some might call espionage, driven by a deeper understanding of justice that transcended traditional boundaries. Calvin's voice suddenly grew louder, his words carrying clearly through the window. Once old Fishers, land is secured, the rest will fall into place. These simple folk don't understand progress, Hensley. Sometimes you have to force their hand for their own good. The casual cruelty in Calvin's tone made Jacob's stomach turn, but he remained still, gathering every detail. Sheriff Hensley's response was more hesitant, suggesting that perhaps not everyone involved in this conspiracy was fully committed to its outcome. The community's starting to ask questions, Calvin. We can't keep this quiet forever. The uncertainty in the sheriff's voice provided Jacob with an unexpected insight. There might be cracks in Calvin's support system that could be exploited. As the conversation continued, Jacob carefully documented mental notes about names, dates, and locations mentioned. Clint had taught him to create memory patterns, linking information to familiar things to ensure nothing would be forgotten. Each piece of evidence gathered was another step toward vindicating his grandfather and exposing the truth about Calvin Briggs's schemes. The sound of approaching footsteps forced Jacob to retreat into the growing darkness. His mission had yielded valuable information, but the real challenge lay ahead. How to use this knowledge without compromising his position or putting his family at greater risk. The weight of his discoveries pressed heavily on his young shoulders as he made his way back home, knowing that what he had learned could change everything, for better or worse. The autumn wind carried whispers of change through Lancaster County as Mary Fisher stood at her kitchen window, watching her son Jacob return from town. His purposeful stride reminded her so much of his late father that it made her heart ache. The past few weeks had transformed her quiet Amish life into something unrecognizable, and at the center of this transformation stood Clint Eastwood, a man who defied easy categorization. Mary's hands trembled slightly as she kneaded the bread dough, her mind racing with the information Jacob had gathered in town. Calvin Briggs's plan to seize their land through manipulated property taxes and falsified documents was more elaborate than they had initially feared. The weight of this knowledge pressed heavily upon her shoulders, much like the responsibility of protecting both her son and her aging father, Eli. Clint's proposed solution seemed almost as dangerous as their current predicament. His plan involved exposing Calvin's corruption through a carefully orchestrated series of events that would require the Fisher family to step outside their traditional ways. The thought of deviating from their peaceful path troubled Mary deeply, yet she couldn't deny the logic behind Clint's strategy. Through the window, she observed Clint and Jacob talking near the barn, their unlikely friendship a testament to life's unexpected turns. The older man's weathered face bore the same determination she'd seen in Jacob's eyes lately. How had this outsider become so intricately woven into their fate? The question lingered as she recalled her initial mistrust of him, how she'd warned Jacob to keep his distance. Sheriff Hensley's patrol car rolled past their property for the third time that day, a reminder of the forces aligned against them. Mary knew the sheriff's loyalty to Calvin Briggs ran deep, fueled by years of mutual benefit and small-town politics. Yet Clint insisted that even Hensley could be turned if presented with the right evidence that Jacob had risked much to obtain. The sound of her father's footsteps on the porch drew Mary from her contemplation. Eli entered the kitchen, his wise eyes meeting hers with understanding. He had always taught her that pride could be as dangerous as fear when it came to making important decisions. Was her reluctance to embrace Clint's help merely pride disguised as principle? The complexity of their situation challenged everything Mary had been taught about keeping separate from the English world. Yet here they were, their very way of life threatened by men who wielded modern weapons of paper and law. How could they fight such battles while remaining true to their beliefs? The question haunted her as she shaped the bread into loaves, each motion a meditation on their future. Jacob's recent actions in town demonstrated both courage and capability, traits that filled Mary with equal measures of pride and concern. Her son was growing into a man amid this crisis, guided not only by their traditional values but also by Clint's pragmatic influence. The blend of these two worlds, while uncomfortable, had produced something unexpected in Jacob, a bridge between the old ways and the new. Calvin Briggs's shadow loomed larger with each passing day. His recent acquisition of neighboring properties created a noose that tightened slowly around their farm. Mary had witnessed similar patterns in other communities, where Amish families were gradually pushed out by rising taxes and legal complications. Would they become another quiet casualty in Calvin's empire-building scheme? Clint's plan offered a path forward, but it required Mary to place her trust in methods that felt foreign to her nature. The evidence Jacob had gathered could expose Calvin's corrupt dealings, but using it meant engaging with the English legal system in ways that went against their traditional approach to conflict resolution. Would choosing this path make them no better than their adversaries? As the sun began its descent behind the cornfields, Mary watched Clint demonstrate something to Jacob, likely another lesson in strategy or observation. Their easy rapport reminded her of simpler times when Jacob's father would teach him about farming and faith. Perhaps she realized God worked through unexpected vessels, bringing help from unlikely sources when it was needed most. The decision before Mary transcended the immediate threat to their land. It touched upon questions of adaptation, survival, and the delicate balance between preserving tradition and embracing necessary change. As she removed the fresh bread from the oven, its wholesome aroma filling the kitchen, Mary understood that sometimes the most faithful choice wasn't the most obvious one. The autumn wind carried a distinct chill as Clint Eastwood stood at the edge of the Fisher property, his weathered fingers wrapped around a cell phone that seemed out of place against the backdrop of the simple Amish farm. After witnessing Mary's internal struggle with trusting an outsider, he knew the next move had to be decisive. The stakes were too high for half measures. Senator William Harrison's voice crackled through the phone, carrying the weight of 3 decades in politics. "Clint, you're calling in a hell of a favor here. Calvin Briggs has friends in high places." The connection between them dated back to a time when Harrison was just a young state representative, and Clint had helped him navigate a particularly thorny situation involving local land rights. "Bill, this isn't about politics. We've got an Amish family being strong-armed off their land by a man who's corrupted the local sheriff and half the county officials." Clint's voice remained steady, but there was an edge to it that the senator recognized from their past dealings. Meanwhile, inside the Fisher home, Jacob watched through the window as Clint paced the property line. The young man's curiosity about the outside world had only grown stronger since Clint's arrival, and he found himself wondering about the complex web of relationships that existed beyond their isolated community. His mother, Mary, busied herself with household tasks, but her attention kept drifting to the same window. The senator's response came with a heavy sigh. "Calvin Briggs has been trying to push through that development project for years. He's got investors from 3 states waiting on this deal." There was a pause, followed by the sound of shuffling papers. "But there's something else you should know. The environmental impact studies he submitted, they're not adding up." Eli Fisher emerged from the barn, his eyes meeting Clint's across the yard. The old man's quiet dignity served as a reminder of everything at stake. The land had been in the Fisher family for generations, its soil holding not just crops but the very essence of their way of life. Sheriff Hensley's patrol car rolled slowly past the property, a not-so-subtle reminder of the local authorities' allegiance, but something in the sheriff's expression, visible through the driver's window, suggested an internal conflict that Clint hadn't noticed before. Perhaps there were cracks in Calvin's foundation of control. "Listen, Bill," Clint continued, lowering his voice as he moved further from the house. "I need access to those environmental reports, and I need to know who signed off on them." The request hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. The senator's response was measured. "You understand what you're asking? This could blow back on a lot of people, including some who've been in office longer than I have." The warning was clear, but so was the hint of cooperation in his tone. Inside his office across town, Calvin Briggs stood at his window, watching the sun set over what he already considered his future development. His phone buzzed with a message from one of his contacts in the state capitol. Something was stirring, and he didn't like the feeling it gave him. The conversation between Clint and the senator continued, delving into details of permits, signatures, and dates that would prove crucial in the days ahead. But beneath the technical discussion lay a deeper current, the story of a community fighting for its survival against the relentless tide of progress. Mary stepped onto the porch, her presence drawing Clint's attention. The trust she had placed in him weighed heavily on his shoulders, making this call not just about winning a fight, but about preserving a way of life that deserved protection. "I'll have those documents to you by morning," the senator finally conceded. "But Clint, watch your back. Calvin Briggs isn't known for taking opposition lightly." The warning carried the weight of experience, suggesting stories untold. As the call ended, Clint noticed Jacob approaching, his young face full of questions about the world beyond their fields. The boy's curiosity represented the bridge between 2 worlds, the traditional life of his family and the modern forces threatening to overwhelm it. How would this young man navigate the changes ahead, regardless of the outcome? The sun was setting, now casting long shadows across the Fisher farm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now Clint had set in motion events that would either save this family's heritage or unleash forces beyond anyone's control. The question remained, in a world where money and power typically prevailed, could the simple truth about right and wrong still make a difference? The morning sun cast long shadows across the Fisher farm as dozens of horse-drawn buggies appeared. On the horizon, their wooden wheels creaking against the gravel road. Clint Eastwood stood beside Eli Fisher on the front porch, watching the unprecedented gathering of Amish families from neighboring communities. Who would have thought that these peaceful, tradition-bound people would unite in such a powerful display of solidarity? Jacob Fisher moved between the arriving buggies, helping elderly community members descend and directing families toward the gathering area. His mother, Mary, distributed water to the travelers, her quiet efficiency masking her concern about this departure from their usual ways. The sight of so many plain people assembled in one place carried both hope and apprehension. Would their peaceful demonstration be enough to counter Calvin Briggs's aggressive tactics? Calvin Briggs observed the growing crowd from his parked SUV half a mile down the road, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. He hadn't anticipated this level of organization from the Amish community. Sheriff Tom Hensley sat beside him, shifting uncomfortably as he watched more buggies arrive. The lawman's conscience had begun to weigh heavily, especially after witnessing the dignity with which these people conducted themselves. As the morning progressed, the gathering took on an almost ceremonial quality. Eli Fisher addressed his fellow community members in Pennsylvania Dutch, his words carrying across the assembled crowd with quiet authority. Clint noticed how the younger members of the community, including Jacob, translated in whispers to ensure everyone understood the message of unity and peaceful resistance. Mary Fisher moved to stand beside Clint, her traditional dress rustling in the breeze. "This is not our way," she said softly, "to make such a public display. And yet sometimes the Lord works through unexpected means." Her words carried no judgment, only a thoughtful observation that reflected the community's struggle to balance their principles with the need to protect their way of life. The demonstration took shape as families positioned their buggies in a wide circle around the disputed property line. Children helped their parents unfurl hand-painted signs with simple messages, "Peace be with you," and "Love thy neighbor." The quiet strength of their presence spoke volumes without raising a single voice in anger. Sheriff Hensley watched the scene unfold through his windshield, his discomfort growing with each passing minute. How had he allowed himself to become entangled in Briggs's schemes? The sight of these families standing together without violence or hatred forced him to confront his own role in their persecution. Jacob approached Clint with a question that cut to the heart of their unlikely alliance. "Will this be enough? Can peaceful resistance really stop someone like Briggs?" The young man's eyes reflected both hope and doubt, mirroring the complex emotions running through the entire gathering. Clint's response was interrupted by the arrival of several news vans, their satellite dishes stretching toward the sky like modern totems. The media presence had been part of the strategy, a calculated risk that would either protect the community through exposure or make them more vulnerable. Which way would the coverage swing? Calvin Briggs slammed his car door, striding toward the gathered crowd with barely contained fury. His expensive suit and aggressive bearing created a stark contrast to the simple dignity of the Amish families. Sheriff Hensley followed more slowly, his hand resting uneasily on his holster as he scanned the peaceful assembly. The community's response to Briggs's approach demonstrated their preparation and unity. Without a word being spoken, the families tightened their circle, creating an impenetrable wall of quiet resistance. Even the children seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, standing tall beside their parents with solemn faces. Mary Fisher stepped forward, positioning herself between Briggs and her father. Her quiet strength seemed to grow from the very earth beneath her feet, drawing power from generations of Fisher farmers who had worked this land. Would this be the moment when tradition and progress found a way to coexist? Or would Briggs's ambition destroy everything these families had built? The cameras rolled as reporters narrated the unfolding scene, their presence adding another layer of tension to the standoff. Clint moved to stand beside Jacob, their unlikely friendship a symbol of the bridges that could be built between different worlds. The young man's shoulders straightened under Clint's steadying hand, ready to face whatever came next. Sheriff Hensley's gaze met Clint's across the crowd, and something shifted in the lawman's expression. Had the weight of conscience finally overcome his loyalty to Briggs? The next few moments would reveal whether justice would prevail through the quiet strength of united hearts, or if more dramatic measures would be required to protect this community's way of life. Sheriff Tom Hensley sat alone in his office, staring at the stack of falsified reports Calvin Briggs had instructed him to file. The morning sun cast long shadows across his desk, much like the growing shadows of doubt darkening his conscience. How had he allowed himself to become so deeply entangled in Briggs's web of corruption? The peaceful protest by the Amish community the day before had shaken something loose inside him. Their quiet dignity and unwavering solidarity stood in stark contrast to the strong-arm tactics Briggs employed. The image of Eli Fisher, standing, tall despite his years, haunted the sheriff's thoughts. The old man's integrity seemed to mock Hensley's compromised position. Across town, Clint Eastwood and Jacob Fisher were working on repairing fence posts at the Fisher farm. Their easy companionship, a testament to the bridges that could be built between different worlds. Jacob's questions about life beyond the Amish community came more frequently now, but they were tempered with a deeper appreciation for his heritage, a balance Clint had helped him find. "Your grandfather's stand yesterday," Clint said, driving, "a post into the soft earth. That took real courage. The kind that doesn't need a gun or a badge to prove itself." The words carried across the field to where Mary Fisher worked in her garden, causing her to pause and reflect on how this outsider had become such an integral part of their struggle. Meanwhile, Calvin Briggs paced his office at the development company, his phone calls growing increasingly desperate. The unified front presented by the Amish community had attracted unwanted attention from state authorities. His carefully constructed plans were beginning to unravel, thread by thread. The sheriff's recent reluctance to follow orders only added to his mounting frustration. Back at the station, Hensley pulled out an old photograph from his desk drawer, himself as a rookie officer, eyes bright with idealism and purpose. When had he lost that young man's sense of right and wrong? The morning's mail had brought a letter from the State Investigation Board, requesting information about recent property disputes in the county. His hand trembled slightly as he reread the official letterhead. Mary Fisher approached the fence line where Clint and Jacob worked, carrying a pitcher of fresh lemonade. The simple gesture spoke volumes about how far they'd come from her initial mistrust of the stranger who'd wandered into their lives. "The English world isn't all bad," she said softly to herself, watching her son laugh at something Clint had said. The sheriff's internal struggle intensified as he recalled the previous week's events. He'd watched Briggs's men harass elderly. Amish farmers had turned a blind eye to falsified property documents, had even participated in intimidation tactics against the Fisher family. Each memory carved deeper grooves of shame into his conscience. Eli Fisher, working in his barn, observed the growing friendship between his grandson and Clint with mixed emotions. The English stranger had proved himself a true friend, yet his presence represented the very changes threatening their way of life. But perhaps, Eli reasoned, some changes were necessary for survival. Sheriff Hensley found himself driving past the Fisher farm that afternoon, his patrol car moving slowly along the dusty road. The sight of Clint working alongside Jacob, Mary, tending to her gardens, and Eli emerging from the barn with fresh hay, it painted a picture of the community he'd sworn to protect, not persecute. The weight of his badge, once a source of pride, now felt like a burden. Each decision he'd made to support Briggs's schemes had added another layer of tarnish to that once shining symbol. The question that had been growing in his mind could no longer be ignored. When had he stopped being a peace officer and become merely an enforcer for corrupt interests? As evening approached, Hensley made an unexpected stop at the Fisher farm. The family's surprise at seeing him was evident, but something in his demeanor, perhaps the absence of his usual bravado, made them wait to hear what he had to say. Could the man who had caused them so much trouble become an ally in their fight against Calvin Briggs? And more importantly, would they be able to trust his change of heart? The autumn wind carried more than just fallen leaves across the Fisher farm. It brought with it an undercurrent of impending confrontation. Calvin Briggs paced his office, his carefully constructed plans unraveling thread by thread. The mounting pressure of failing bank loans and the Fisher family's continued resistance had pushed him to the edge of reason. How had a simple land grab become so complicated? His phone call to Sheriff Hensley went unanswered for the third time that morning. The growing distance from his once reliable ally only fueled his paranoia. Calvin had noticed the change in Hensley's demeanor ever since that stranger, Clint Eastwood, had arrived in town. The sheriff's newfound conscience threatened everything Calvin had worked for. Across town, Eli Fisher and Clint sat at the family's worn kitchen table, reviewing documents that Mary had discovered in her late husband's study. The yellowed papers revealed a pattern of systematic harassment against Amish farmers in the region, all leading back to Calvin's father's time. The revelation sparked a fire in Clint's eyes. The same manipulation had played out across generations. Jacob entered the kitchen, his traditional hat in hand, sharing news from their English neighbors. Other families had begun speaking out about Calvin's tactics, emboldened by the Fishers' resistance. The young man's voice carried a mixture of hope and concern as he detailed how Calvin's associates had been seen gathering at the edge of town. Mary watched from the doorway as her son spoke, noting how he had grown in recent weeks. The presence of Clint had awakened something in Jacob, a bridge between their peaceful ways and the necessity of standing firm against injustice. But would this awakening come at too high a cost? Calvin's desperation manifested in a flurry of legal notices and thinly veiled threats. His lawyers descended upon the local courthouse, filing motion after motion. Yet for every legal maneuver, Clint and the Fishers found a counter, their resistance strengthened by the growing support of the community. The tension reached its peak when Calvin's men began parking their trucks along the Fishers' property line. Their presence cast long shadows across the harvested fields, a silent intimidation that spoke volumes about Calvin's intentions. Would he really risk everything on one final desperate push? Sheriff Hensley observed these developments from his patrol car, parked at the crossroads between duty and conscience. The weight of years of compliance with Calvin's schemes pressed heavily upon him. Each passing hour brought him closer to a decision that would define the remainder of his career and his character. Inside the Fisher home, Clint recognized the signs of imminent conflict. His experiences had taught him that desperate men were the most dangerous. He shared quiet words with Eli about preparing for what might come, while being mindful of their peaceful principles. How could they defend what was right without compromising who they were? The community began to stir as word spread of Calvin's aggressive positioning. English neighbors drove past the Fisher farm more frequently, their presence a silent show of solidarity. Even the typically isolated Amish family sent word through Jacob. They stood ready to help in their own way. Mary found herself at the heart of this growing resistance, her quiet strength providing a foundation for both her, father and son. She had watched her husband stand against similar pressures years ago. Now, as she observed Clint's protective presence around her family, she wondered if history was offering them a second chance at justice. Calvin's desperation reached new heights as his financial backers began demanding results. His carefully maintained facade of legitimate business dealings cracked under the strain. Would his final push become his ultimate undoing? The answer lay in the choices of those he had manipulated, and in the strength of an unlikely alliance between an Amish family and a stranger who had become their defender. As the sun set on another tense day, the Fisher farm stood as a testament to resilience. The evening brought no resolution, only the certainty that Calvin's desperate gambit would soon reach its climax. In the gathering darkness, both sides prepared for what morning would bring, knowing that the outcome would reshape more than just the fate of one Amish farm. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the Fisher farm, an uneasy silence blanketed the dew-covered fields. Clint Eastwood stood beside Eli Fisher on the front porch of the weathered farmhouse, both men watching as Calvin Briggs's convoy of trucks rolled down the dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust in their wake. How many lives would be forever changed by what transpired in the next few hours? Jacob Fisher emerged from the barn, his young face set with determination that belied his 17 years. The months of mentorship under Clint's guidance had transformed the once uncertain Amish youth into someone who understood that sometimes standing one's ground meant more than simply following tradition. Mary Fisher watched her son from the kitchen window, her hands clasped in silent prayer. Calvin Briggs stepped out of his lead vehicle, flanked by a dozen men carrying an assortment of tools and weapons that left little doubt about their intentions. Sheriff Tom Hensley's patrol car pulled up behind them, its presence a stark reminder of how deeply corruption had seeped into the local law enforcement. The sheriff's conflicted expression suggested an internal struggle between duty and the strings that Calvin pulled. "This ends today, Fisher," Calvin called out, his voice carrying across the morning air. "You're either walking away from this farm, or we're removing you ourselves." Eli's weathered hands gripped the porch railing, his quiet strength unwavering. "The Lord gave us this land, Mr. Briggs, and only He can take it away." The tension mounted as Calvin's men spread out, their movements calculated and threatening. But something unexpected began to happen. From behind the barn, along the tree line, and down the neighboring roads, vehicles appeared. Dozens of community members, both English and Amish, emerged to stand with the Fishers. Who could have predicted that Calvin's greed would unite two distinct worlds? Clint stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. The skills that had served him throughout his life now focused on preventing bloodshed rather than causing it. "You're outnumbered, Calvin. And not just by people. You're outnumbered by something you don't understand. Community." Sheriff Hensley's gaze swept across the gathering crowd, recognition dawning in his eyes as he saw familiar faces from both sides of the cultural divide. His hand moved away from his holster, and he took a step back from Calvin's group. Would this be the moment that defined his redemption? Mary joined her father and son on the porch, her quiet dignity a reminder of everything they fought to preserve. The morning light caught the silver threads in her prayer covering as she stood tall beside her family. Jacob's hand found hers, a gesture that spoke volumes about the strength they drew from each other. Calvin's men began to shift uncomfortably, looking to their leader for direction. The simple math of the situation was undeniable. They were surrounded by a force greater than their numbers, weapons, or legal manipulations. But Calvin Briggs had never been one to accept defeat gracefully. "This isn't over," he snarled, his facade of business civility cracking under pressure. "You think hiding behind these people will save you? I've got contracts, lawyers." "What you've got," Sheriff Hensley interrupted, surprising everyone as he stepped forward, "is a list of violations long enough to keep you occupied in court for years." The sheriff's words hung in the air, heavy, with the weight of choice and consequence. Had the tide finally turned against Calvin's schemes? The standoff teetered on a knife's edge. Would Calvin's desperation drive him to violence, or would the show of unity force him to back down? The answer lay in the next few moments as the sun continued its ascent over the Fisher farm, illuminating a scene that would be remembered for generations to come. Clint caught Jacob's eye, seeing in the young man's face the same determination he'd worked to instill over their time together. The mentor and mentee shared a silent understanding. Sometimes the greatest victories come not from confrontation, but from standing firm in what you believe. But would that be enough to end this conflict without bloodshed? The morning breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut hay and possibility, as two worlds stood united against the forces that threatened to tear apart more than just one family's farm. What would be written in the pages of history about this day, when tradition and progress found common ground in the defense of something greater than themselves? The morning mist clung to the rolling Pennsylvania farmland, as distant sirens pierced the tense standoff between Calvin Briggs's men and the gathered Amish community. Clint Eastwood maintained his position beside Eli Fisher, his weathered hand steady on his holstered weapon, while Jacob and Mary Fisher stood resolute among their neighbors. Calvin Briggs's face contorted with confusion as 3 unmarked sedans and 4 state police cruisers rolled down the dirt road toward the Fisher farm. The arrival of law enforcement should have bolstered his confidence, yet something in Sheriff Hensley's sudden pallor suggested otherwise. What had changed in the delicate power balance that had protected Calvin's schemes for so long? State Attorney General investigators emerged from the vehicles, their badges catching the early morning light. The lead investigator, a stern-faced woman in her 50s, approached with purposeful steps, bypassing Calvin's stammering attempt at greeting. She produced a thick manila envelope, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "Mr. Calvin Briggs, we have a warrant for your arrest on multiple charges of corruption, fraud, and conspiracy." Sheriff Hensley's hand trembled as he reached for his badge, the weight of his compromised position finally becoming too heavy to bear. The years of accepting Calvin's influence had led to this moment of reckoning. Would his eventual cooperation with state authorities be enough to salvage what remained of his honor? Jacob watched the scene unfold, his young face reflecting both vindication and disbelief. The months of witnessing his grandfather's struggle against Calvin's pressure, the nights spent worried about losing their land, all culminated in this watershed moment. He glanced at Clint, remembering their conversations about standing firm against injustice, about finding strength in conviction rather than compromise. The evidence presented by the state investigators painted a damning picture of Calvin's operations. Falsified land documents, manipulated water rights, and a trail of bribes that stretched across 3 counties emerged from the investigation. Mary Fisher's hand found her father's arm as they listened to the litany of charges, each one representing a piece of their community that Calvin had attempted to destroy. Eli Fisher remained silent throughout the proceedings, his quiet dignity a sharp contrast to Calvin's increasingly desperate protests. The old farmer's patience and faith had been tested severely, but his unwavering belief in justice had finally been rewarded. How many others had suffered under Calvin's schemes before? The truth finally emerged. The state police began securing Calvin's men, their weapons confiscated, their bravado deflating under the weight of official scrutiny. Sheriff Hensley, after a long moment of internal struggle, stepped forward to provide his statement, detailing years of corruption that had poisoned local law enforcement. His testimony would prove crucial in dismantling Calvin's network of influence. Clint observed the proceedings with measured satisfaction, noting how the community's unity had never wavered despite the pressure. The Amish families stood together, their strength drawn not from weapons or threats but from an unshakable sense of right and wrong. Would their example of peaceful resistance leave a lasting impact on the broader community? The morning progressed as statements were taken and documents processed. Calvin Briggs, now handcuffed and facing the consequences of his actions, was led to a waiting police vehicle. His final glare toward the Fisher family carried no power, his threats rendered hollow by the arrival of justice. The man who had sought to build his empire by destroying others would now watch his carefully constructed world crumble from behind bars. Mary approached Clint as the law enforcement vehicles began departing, their lights flashing one final time across the peaceful farmland. Her expression carried gratitude tinged with newfound respect. The stranger who had arrived on their land had become an instrumental force in their deliverance from Calvin's threats. How had their initial wariness transformed into such profound trust? Jacob's presence beside his mother and grandfather completed the picture of family resilience. The young man had grown through the ordeal, his understanding of both his Amish heritage and the outside world deepened by the experience. His relationship with Clint had opened new perspectives while strengthening his appreciation for his community's values. The gathered families began dispersing, returning to their farms and daily routines with lighter hearts. The shadow that had loomed over their community had finally been lifted, revealing a brighter future built on the foundation of their unwavering faith and unity. What new challenges would they face, and how would this experience shape their path forward? The autumn wind carried whispers of change through Lancaster County as state police vehicles rolled into town, their presence casting long shadows across Calvin Briggs's carefully constructed empire. Sheriff Tom Hensley stood at his office window, watching the methodical approach of justice with a weight pressing against his chest that had nothing to do with his badge. Years of compromise and moral concessions played through his mind like a worn film reel. How had he allowed Calvin's influence to corrupt the very oath he'd sworn to uphold? The evidence against Calvin lay spread across his desk: doctored land deeds, falsified documents, and a trail of financial misconduct that led straight to the heart of their small community. Clint Eastwood's arrival at the station drew Hensley's attention from his troubled reflections. The former lawman's weathered face carried none of the smugness one might expect from someone who'd been proven right all along. Instead, there was only a quiet understanding that resonated with Hensley's own internal struggle. "You know what needs to be done, Tom," Clint said, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "The question is whether you'll be the one to do it." The choice before Hensley crystallized with stark clarity. The state authorities would make the arrest regardless, but who would step forward to restore honor to their local law enforcement? Who would show the community that justice could still prevail from within? Across town, the Fisher family gathered on their porch, watching the unusual activity with mixed emotions. Jacob stood beside his mother, Mary, while Eli sat in his familiar rocking chair, his hands folded in silent prayer. The sight of their united front reminded Hensley of everything he'd failed to protect over the years. Calvin Briggs sat in his opulent office, unaware of the approaching storm. His phone rang repeatedly, warnings from his network of informants, but he dismissed them with the arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. How many lives had he manipulated? How many dreams had he crushed beneath his ambitions? The decision crystallized in Hensley's mind as he reached for his badge, feeling its weight with new purpose. He turned to Clint, who had remained silent, respecting the internal battle playing out before him. "I've spent years being part of the problem," Hensley said, checking his service weapon. "Time to be part of the solution." The drive to Calvin's office became a journey of redemption. Each mile marked the distance between who Hensley had become and who he'd once sworn to be. Clint followed in his own vehicle, a silent guardian ensuring justice would prevail one way or another. Calvin's surprise at seeing Hensley enter his office quickly turned to understanding as he noted the resolution in the sheriff's stance. "Come. Now, Tom, we both know how this works. Whatever they think they have, it won't stick. It never does." But something had shifted in the atmosphere. The familiar dance of power and corruption had lost its rhythm. Hensley's voice carried a strength that had long been absent as he began reading Calvin his rights. The click of handcuffs echoed through the office like a final punctuation mark on Calvin's reign. As Hensley led him out, their paths crossed with the state authorities arriving to secure the scene. The evidence would ensure Calvin's schemes would finally see the light of day. Outside, members of the community gathered, drawn by the unprecedented sight of their most powerful citizen being led away in custody. Among them stood the Fisher family, their presence a testament to the resilience of truth over corruption. Mary caught Hensley's eye as he passed, and in her gaze, he found not condemnation, but understanding. Perhaps redemption, like justice, was never too late to pursue. Jacob stood tall beside his mother, his young face reflecting the kind of hope that had once inspired Hensley to pin on his badge for the first time. Clint watched from the periphery as Hensley placed Calvin in the back of his patrol car. Their eyes met briefly, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them. Sometimes the hardest battles weren't fought with fists or firearms, but with the courage to choose right over wrong, no matter how late in the game. As the patrol car pulled away, the autumn wind seemed to shift, carrying with it the promise of renewal. The community had witnessed more than an arrest. They had seen the power of one person's choice to stand for justice, even when that choice came at the end of a long road of mistakes. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the Fisher farm as the community processed the dramatic events that had unfolded. Calvin Briggs's arrest sent ripples through both the English and Amish communities, forcing everyone to confront the true cost of standing together against corruption. But what price would they all pay for this hard-won victory? Clint Eastwood stood at the edge of Eli Fisher's cornfield, watching Jacob help his grandfather repair the damage to their fence. A tangible reminder of Calvin's failed intimidation tactics. The young man's movements were more confident now, his shoulders straight with newfound purpose. How many other young people would find their voice after witnessing this stand against injustice? Mary Fisher approached Clint, carrying a basket of fresh bread. The wariness that had once clouded her eyes had been replaced by quiet respect. "The English neighbors are gathering at the miller's farm tonight," she said. "They've invited us to join them." Her words carried the weight of changing times. When had the Amish last received such an invitation? Across town, Sheriff Tom Hensley sat in his office, staring at the badge he'd nearly tarnished beyond redemption. The evidence against Calvin Briggs mounted as more people came forward, each revelation exposing how deeply the corruption had penetrated their quiet community. But could a broken system truly heal itself? Jacob paused in his work, watching a group of English teenagers drive past the farm. Instead of the usual taunts, they waved, a simple gesture that spoke volumes about the shifting dynamics. He caught Clint's eye, and both understood that something fundamental had changed. But would this newfound unity survive once the excitement faded? Eli Fisher gathered his family for evening prayers, including Clint in the circle without hesitation. The old man's weathered hands trembled slightly as he gave thanks, not just for their victory, but for the unexpected allies who had helped them achieve it. How many generations of mistrust had been bridged in these few crucial days? The news of Calvin's arrest spread through neighboring counties, drawing attention they'd never wanted. Reporters began appearing at the edge of Amish territory, hungry for a story about the community that had dared to stand up to corruption. Would their peaceful way of life survive this unwanted spotlight? Mary watched her son with a mixture of pride and concern. Jacob moved easily between their world and the English one now, helping translate for those who came seeking guidance on how to resist similar pressures in their own communities. But where would this path ultimately lead him? Sheriff Hensley's deputies, freed from Calvin's influence, worked to rebuild trust with both communities. They attended barn raisings, helped direct traffic during harvest time, and learned to respect the delicate balance between maintaining law and honoring tradition. Could two such different approaches to life truly find lasting common ground? Clint found himself becoming an unexpected bridge between worlds. English farmers sought his advice on dealing with their Amish neighbors, while Amish families quietly approached him about navigating the modern world's complexities. Had he somehow stumbled into a role far larger than he'd ever imagined? The Miller's gathering that evening reflected their new reality. English and Amish sat together, sharing food and cautious conversation. Children played together in the barn, their laughter unconcerned with cultural differences. Yet beneath the celebration lay deeper questions. How would they maintain this unity? What challenges awaited them beyond this moment of triumph? Jacob stood at the edge of the gathering, watching his mother engage in careful conversation with English neighbors while his grandfather taught curious children about their ways. The young man's face reflected both hope and uncertainty, the same expression worn by many that evening. Where would this new path lead them all? As night fell, over the peaceful gathering, the cost of their victory became clearer. They had won more than just a battle against corruption. They had cracked open the door to change itself. But change, even positive change, always demands its price. Would they all be willing to pay it? The morning dew settled on the Fisher farm's weathered fence posts as Clint Eastwood stood beside his packed horse, watching the sun peek over the eastern horizon. The events of the past weeks had transformed this quiet Amish community, leaving an indelible mark on both the land and its people. But perhaps no one had been more affected than Clint himself, who had found an unexpected home among these simple, steadfast folk. Jacob Fisher approached from the barn, his young face bearing a maturity that hadn't been there when Clint first arrived. The boy, no, the young man, carried himself differently now, with a quiet confidence that spoke of lessons learned and battles fought. "Will you really leave without saying goodbye to everyone?" Jacob asked, his voice carrying a hint of disappointment. Clint adjusted his hat, buying time before responding. The truth was he'd never been good at goodbyes, preferring to slip away like morning mist before the sun grew too high. But this time felt different. These people had become more than just another stop along his endless journey. Mary Fisher emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. The initial distrust she'd shown toward Clint had evolved into something resembling respect, perhaps even friendship. Behind her, Eli Fisher's tall frame filled the doorway, his weathered face creased with the wisdom of years. "The English world has its ways and we have ours," Eli said, stepping forward to stand beside his daughter and grandson. "But sometimes God brings people together for reasons we cannot fully understand." The old man extended his hand to Clint, breaking with tradition to offer this gesture of respect. Calvin Briggs's defeat had brought peace to the valley, but it had also marked the end of Clint's purpose here. Sheriff Hensley, now free from Briggs's influence, had begun rebuilding trust with both the English and Amish communities. The morning's stillness was broken only by the distant sound of horses and buggies as families made their way to the weekly gathering. "You've taught me more than just how to stand up to bullies," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion. "You showed me that sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is choose peace over violence." The words hung in the air, a testament to the unexpected wisdom that had grown from their unlikely friendship. Mary stepped forward, holding a carefully wrapped package. "We know you don't take much with you on your travels," she said, "but I hope you'll accept this." Inside was a hand-stitched quilt, its patterns telling the story of their time together in subtle ways only those who had lived it would understand. The gift represented more than just cloth and thread. It was a piece of the life Clint had briefly shared with them. He ran his fingers over the intricate stitching, remembering the nights spent planning their stand against Briggs, the quiet conversations with Jacob about finding one's path, and the gradual acceptance he'd earned from the community. Eli's voice broke through Clint's contemplation. "You came here as a stranger, but you leave as family." The words carried the weight of truth, spoken by a man who measured each statement carefully before letting it pass his lips. The sun had risen higher now, casting long shadows across the farmyard. Clint secured the quilt to his saddle. Each movement, deliberate and measured, he turned to face the family that had become his own, knowing that this farewell would stay with him long after the dust of the trail had settled. "A man's path isn't always clear," Clint said, looking at Jacob. "But sometimes it's the detours that teach us the most about where we're headed." The young man nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind the words. As Clint mounted his horse, more community members began arriving at the Fisher farm, drawn by word of his departure. Among them was Sheriff Hensley, who raised his hand in a gesture of respect, a far cry from their first hostile encounter. The morning air carried the scent of fresh-baked bread and newly cut hay as Clint guided his horse toward the road. Ear didn't look back immediately, allowing the sounds of the farm to paint one final picture in his mind. The quiet strength of Eli, Mary's steadfast devotion to her family, and Jacob's growing understanding of his place between two worlds. Only when he reached the crest of the hill did Clint turn in his saddle, taking in the scene below. The Fisher farm stood as a testament to perseverance, its buildings and fields a patchwork of old ways and new beginnings. The morning sun caught the windows of the house, making them shine like beacons in the valley. What would become of them all? Would Jacob find his balance between tradition and change? Would Mary discover new happiness in the life she'd chosen? Would Eli see his community continue to thrive in the face of an ever-changing world? These questions would remain with Clint, joining the collection of memories he carried from all the places he'd been and all the lives he'd touched. With a gentle nudge, he urged his horse forward. The road ahead stretched out before him, leading to new horizons and untold stories. But a part of him would always remain in this peaceful valley, where he'd learned that sometimes the greatest adventures come from the most unexpected places. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.